Hello, everyone. I see some of you decide to stick around, so I must be doing something good. Um, for all the ones that didn't do the previous lab yet, stop this video and go back and finish the previous exercise because we will build on top of the previous exercise, and you will only learn Python scripting and automation by doing, not by just watching some videos. I know there are some people who didn't finish the labs without naming any names. You know who I'm talking about. Get back to the previous video, finish your previous lab and script, and then come back to this one. For the ones that did finish their previous script, welcome back and let's get started. So I just opened the last script we made in the last video, which does a show system info, gets that information, converts it to JSON so we can easily access the fields that we need to print out the information that our customer needs for his audit and in this format. So this is the script, and today we will build up upon that because you might think like, okay, that was easy last time. You just copy paste the first API call that they mentioned in documentation, and that's that. How does that help us to make our own API calls? I agree with you, and that's why today we will go and look at how we can build our own API calls, and regardless of it's documented somewhere or not, what tools can we use to build our own API calls? So we'll just build upon what we did last time. We will save this as exercise 2 and then start editing it. So let's go here, save as, and we will call it exercise 2, save it, and now we have a new file. So we'll clean up this file a little bit, and you will see in the future when you start scripting, most of the time you will have something that you reuse. Uh, it, you can call it a cookie cutter. You will have like a framework that you build for yourself that you do a lot of API calls with, or either API calls or the SDK and so on, that you use instead of always retyping like this request get and so on and so on. You will have something that is almost ready for you to always use and put your information in. That will save you a lot of time. So for now, we'll just always save as and build upon the previous script if it's needed. Maybe in a later video in the future, we can look at how to build your own, let's say, cookie cutters that is a little bit ready to use, to be able to easily do API calls. So instead of building everything and writing the code from scratch every time, no, you will use something like a template that you made yourself, in which you just put, for example, the API call in it, the path, for example, and it will do. That's it. This way, you can build very easily and very quickly scripts for your customer, and it's much better and much easier, much faster, and so on. So for now, we'll just save as. We have this first script saved as exercise 2, and now we can edit it. So first of all, I want to remove this API call to generate an API key. We don't need that anymore. We have our API key from last time, and that's it. So something I want to do before we continue is, I don't like the URL being hard coded like this, everything in the request get. I want to use variables, and from now on, I will not call them buckets anymore, or objects or whatever. It is variables. I think now that you made your first script, you are a mature scripter to be able to understand what a variable is. If not, there's a lot of amazing resources online. You could Google it. You could search in YouTube for Python variables, and then you can learn much more about variables. So last time we quickly covered what variables are. We used a couple of variables, but for now, we will just continue and call these variables. In the future, we will go deeper in other kinds of variables, like integer, like lists, dictionaries. Um, but for now, we will just call them variables and continue with that. So how do we use variables in this URL? last time we used something called the f string. So we mentioned that we can print something out. If we would print it out, we can't use the variables because it doesn't know about it. But if we add the f in front of this, okay, then suddenly if we put something between these curly brackets, it will get the value and print out the value instead of the variable name itself. So we will use the same principle here in the URL, because it doesn't only work for print. We could use it for the request get as well. So we will do the same. So to start, first of all, we will have to add the f in front of the quotes. So now it's an f string, and now we'll have to replace the fields or the parts of the text that we want to have as a variable with these curly brackets and a variable name. So in how many pieces would we cut up this URL? It's always a difficult question, and we will start with a certain approach, and maybe in the future we'll change it depending on how we will use the API calls in the future. But for now, I think we can have the IP, right? So very simple, we call it firewall IP, and we put it as a string between double quotes. This is the first variable. Now we could select this IP, and instead of having the hard-coded IP between these curly brackets, we could put the variable which is firewall IP. We could do the same for this part, because after that we have the let's say API path. So I think we can start as a first phase to call this, for example, action. Okay, very nice. And we will place it now from the slash up to the up, and call it firewall action. Better to call it API action, as it's not related to the firewall per se. Then we have the API path, which goes all the way to the N key. We will call it API path, let's say. Also a string. Now we can select it again all the way to the end key, and then call it API path. And then we come to the key. The key, I don't want to take and key equals to and the key itself, because I want to have the key separate like this. To have it, maybe I want to use it somewhere else. Maybe I want to use it in a specific function or whatever. So I want to keep it as is, and I want this text to stay in the URL. Same with with the IP, for example. I didn't put the HTTPS double or HTTPS colon slash slash here, because I want to have it separate in case I want to use it somewhere else and I want to use the same variable. So the same with the key. I will just copy the key in itself, and I'll already put the name in, but I don't have to select it again. I will call it API key. Okay, and now I will create the variable with the information that I copied, and also this will be a string. So now you see it's much shorter, much readable, and the most important thing is that you can reuse it. For example, if I have a huge amount of API calls, I won't have to recreate or change every API call with a new IP if I have a new IP. For example, my other firewall, which I want to execute um, the same API call to, is 186. So if I had multiple API calls and the IP was hard coded, I would have to change it everywhere, and maybe I will make some mistakes and so on. Now I could just change it here, and all the API calls will be reflected. Same with the API path. For example, let's say I have multiple different API calls in one script. The IP is the same, the API, the key is the same, but the path changes because I need some different information. Instead of creating multiple times the same um, or copying the same get request. No, I could just now, for example, this is API path. I can create new variable API path 2 and then put it here and I copy paste this request, add instead of API path, make it API path 2, and suddenly I have a completely new API call without changing the key, without changing the IP, and so on. So this is the reason why it's much easier, and everything should work as is. So let's save that and run it. So Python 3, example 2, and we have an issue. Um, this is in my case because I every time I run a script or I create a new video, I run something which is like a sandbox or a virtual environment. So I have to reinstall a requests. This is not for you. This is only for me because in your case, if you didn't use a virtual environment, these modules will be already installed from last time. In my case, because I always use a different virtual environment, it is not installed. So you don't have to do that unless you also get the module error. So now if I run the script, perfect, everything is working fine. I get the same result. So this URL is fine together with these variables. So let's continue now. I want to clean up this script because we don't need the system info anymore. We don't need all of this information that we had as that was a previous request from the customer and the previous script. Now we are going to build another script. So all of this we can remove. I will leave this because actually this is something that we will reuse a lot. We will do a request, which is the API call, store it in a variable, and then get the text for this and store it, parse it from XML to a dictionary, and then store the dictionary here. So, but because before we had sysinfo as the command or as the information that we wanted, we could maybe just rename these variables to be more general so that we can reuse them. So let's call it API call, and then we of course have to get the text for API call as we renamed it, and then for example API call dict. So now we should get the same result and everything should be fine. So the question is, how do we get information or documentation from the firewall to create our API calls? So you have multiple ways. First of all, looking at the firewall, you have the GUI and you have the CLI. We will start with the CLI and then we will go to the GUI. So how do we use the CLI to get information? So first of all, let's log into the CLI. SSH. Okay. So how do you find a command on the firewall without having, for example, internet access? Let's say you're at a customer and you don't have internet access. You remember there's a command which has a specific word in it, but you don't know the exact command. So how do I get this information? So there is a great command or a great function in the firewall which allows you to search for commands. So if you type find, you tab again, so and then you have keyword. If you run this with a keyword, it will look for all CLI commands that have this keyword. For example, let's say I want to have something with address. If I enter now, it will show me all the information or all the commands that use the keyword address. So for example, if I want to see show running security policy address, I can just copy paste it here and you see the command is working. So this is one way to get the command. Another way is to just Google it, because not everything, let's say for example, I want to know the connections per second of a firewall. Mm, Maybe it will not show in the exact CLI command, this keyword. So it will not show up like that. So in that case, you could just Google it. And let's try it. So let's say I want to show sessions CLI Palo Alto firewall. So here we can see show session all filter state active. This gives you all sessions, gives you a session for a specific ID, and so on. So this is not what I wanted, but you understand what I'm trying to say. Is if you don't know how to get some specific information, you can always Google it. Let's say I want to know connections per second. Show connections second about the firewall CLI. And this looks interesting as well. Show system statistics session and show system statistics application and so on. So these are commands that you could use. What I'm interested in, more interested in, is show session info, because this is here we can see a lot of information that could be interesting if you're looking at, for example, putting a zone protection profile, sizing the firewall, and so on. So this is a very interesting command. Let me copy this command and let me go back to the firewall. So now I put this command here. I get a lot of interesting information as it showed in the KB. So how do I get this information in an API call? So we have something interesting in the Palo Alto firewall to get the actual API call when you run a CLI command. We have the same for GUI. We will get back to that. But for the CLI as well, any CLI command or any command that you run in CLI on the firewall, you could get the API call for that. How do we get that? So we first have to run a command. Okay. So we type in debug CLI on, and that's it. So now let's run the same command that we just did before, and let's see what the result is. Okay, so now you suddenly see other information, container tag, blah, 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 request. Okay, then you have something that looks like a API call. Okay, then you get the information in what? In a response tag, just like when we did XML or an API call for the show system info. So this looks interesting. So we have operations, show system info, and so on. So to compare it with our previous example, we had here show system info, right? Show system info. This information, this is what we use to get the system information. Here we get operations, show system info, where I'm not sure about this operations, because show system info, show session info. Let's try show system info and see what the result is when we enable the debug CLI. Show system info. If we would run this command, we would get the same information. I'm not going to do it now, but you could try it at home. So you will get the same. Operations, show session info would be show system info. So this is my API call for show session info. Okay. Let me copy that. And let me put it here. So now we just updated the variable. Instead of show system info, it would show session info, and cmd equals will stay the same. So let's run it and see if we get anything. First, we have to add, of course, a print statement, because now we won't see anything to this on the screen. So let's print out the dictionary. API call dict. Okay. And look at that. You get the same. You have, for example, here TMO TCP 3600. Let's just try it again, because so we have again, you see the response here, status success, then we have the result like before, and now we have, for example, number of sessions supported. The information that comes here doesn't have the exact same names, but what I'm interested in is in throughput and packet rate. So do I find something with throughput and packet rate? Remember when we used the JSON tool online to make it more visible? We will just do the same. Okay, and let's paste it here. Again, we don't do it for real customer data. It's just a lab. If you have real customer data, there's a lot of other ways you could do that. So if I go to the viewer, result. So we had the throughput that we wanted and the packet rate. So let's go and see if we can get this information. Packets per second. And then we also have connections per second. You might think, okay, well, that's strange. Why did they call it like that here? And so this is different than what we saw in the CLI. This happens, and that's why I took this example, because sometimes it's not straightforward to the names will not always be the same. So if we look at the CLI again, you will look that everything is zero now because it's a lab firewall. But at a certain time, you or when it's a production environment, you will be able to match these names together based on the values. For example, um, this is how you could match these two together. Again, I took deliberately a difficult thing or difficult example to make you understand that it's not always exactly the same, because this is a very long name, and sometimes you will have to match these things together. So in our case, for example, we need connections per second. This is the most important part for me to extract, because this is what we want to do, or that what we need to build the let's say zone protection profile. So how do I extract the CPS? Well, in this case, it's very easy. Everything is under result. So like we did before, how do we do that? We go and we start printing out the information. So we have on the top response. After that, we have result. And these will always be recurring if you make an API call. And in our case, we need CPS. Again, this is a lab. I don't want to make it complicated for you guys to have a client that generates traffic and so on. If you have a big lab, you could create a client that is connected to a specific interface of this firewall, and then generate traffic so that you can see that this information is there instead of just showing 0. But to make it easy accessible for everyone, we I decided not to make it like that. So as you can see, it's 0. So we extracted the correct information, and this is how we build our own API call based on a CLI command. So the same is for any CLI command that you think of. For example, let's try and find another command keyword, let's say security, let's say show running security policy addresses. Again, it's a good one. If I run the same CLI command, sorry, a mistake. If I run the same CLI command, so again, instead of just showing me the information, you see that now it's in a kind of API request, let's say format. You see the request, you see here, show running security policy addresses. Why is it here operations and so on? We will come back to that later. For now, just try to compare and run. Let's say, for example, you didn't know, you just copied operations like this. Oh, it's not working. And then you copied this, it's working. That's enough for now. The important thing is that you can extract this information. Later, you will understand why this tag is used here and so on. As you know, firewall has the operational, let's say CLI, and then the configure mode. So this is related to that, but for now, try to just use everything between these operations tag. You'll see that it has a response result again, and then you have a lot of information regarding to the command that we run. So you could use it for any CLI command. Again, here I took a difficult one to show you that it's not always very straightforward. Like for example, when we did show system info, the example of the documentation, it was very straightforward because the values and the names were exactly the same. Um, that's also why it's in the documentation, because it's very straightforward to get started with. And I promised you that we would not just copy things in the documentation and show you the easy parts. No, I will always also show you the more difficult parts. So this is one of these things that I want to show you, that sometimes you have to find a mix and match. Most important thing is that you know how to run the CLI command. Okay, this is the most important thing, how to run the CLI command and get the API call from that. So again, the command that we use is debug CLI on. And that's the most important thing for CLI commands. Now, I think with that we covered the how to get the API call from CLI, and we could go back to the GUI for now and see how we could use the GUI to do the same. So let's go to the GUI, and let's while we're in the GUI, uh, we could go to something called debug. What does debug do? Well, actually, debug does the same as what you saw in the in the uh, in the CLI. It does the same, but then for a GUI. So let me open another tab with with just the firewall, so we can play in the GUI while we have the debug open. My lab firewall is super fast. So let's go to objects for now and just leave it there. So when you come to /debug, this is the URL that we used. It redirects you, but /debug is enough. You will see that you have a couple of buttons on the top and some text in the middle. So when you enable debug, it will look at what you're doing and then generate a debug which has the API calls. So let's clear the debug for now, make it empty. Let's enable debug. And now let's go back to the GUI. When we go to the GUI, I could do an action. For example, I can click add an address and call it test YouTube. I call it text, no problem. And I give it an IP of 1122. Okay, so if I click OK now, I have this text YouTube. Now I could refresh here, and now let's look for. Already I see it here, but in case you have a lot of debug, you could just do Control F and call, for example, the object. Why did I call it text YouTube? Well, it's always better to create, especially if you're in your lab. I don't recommend in production, but in your lab when you're building your script, to use a name that doesn't exist. For example, if I would call it web server 1 and I have already web server 2 and 3, it will be difficult to differentiate between them. While if you call it like something like this, totally different name, unrelated to your to your environment, then it's very easy to search for it. So look at this. If you look at this, you see that we can see a request, you see an object, you see a path, right? So and then you have some information here. So the slash debug will help you in how to create, how to know what you do in the GUI and how to do it through API. So if I use search again and search for this specific address, you can see that you can see it adds it in the configuration, but this is the most important thing for us. Sending request command set object is this. So you know the path here for the API call, and how to get it and how to create things and so on. Again, maybe it's not 100% clear to you now. All pieces of what you read here, we will little by little, when we add to our knowledge of Python and API, it will get easier. But for now, you can see that, for example, uh, this debug gives you the exact call that you do in the GUI. So we could now extract both the API calls from a GUI action and from a CLI command. So now, if you look at it, there's everything should be able to be done through an API call. So you might think, well, actually, to be honest, this is a little bit difficult for me. I don't know how to read these debugs and so on. Maybe the CLI was much easier than this one, as it doesn't have all the rest. But of course, in the GUI, sometimes you want to understand when you do something, how does it work, and what action does it do, because you don't know how to do it, for example, through CLI or whatever. So you have to know both of them. I know it looks a little bit complicated for now, but you could clearly see that you have the API path here, and little by little, as I mentioned, we will know how to read complete things, and I will try to revisit the same page on a later stage when we have more parts of the API call that we can match to this. So the debug, as we mentioned, is here as well. When you're finished, of course, you can disable it. For example, clear the debug, and we will go now to a last part or two parts, which is we saw that the API calls have an API path, just like with the address object, it had a specific API path. How do we get that? Well, if you ever took a backup from the firewall, you will know that if you look at the XML, right, it has this path. So, for example, if I wanted to have something like under shared, um, let's say, I don't know, application or services, whatever, you will see that you can get the XML path, right? And the way you build, it's very simple. It's from the top, and you build based on that. How do we do that? How do we know the API? Or how do we know the XPath, or the XML path that we want to make an API call to without going through the backup configuration? Let's say, for example, this is difficult for me because now I don't know how to use it. I don't know where to look for something. Is there an easier way? Yes. So we could extract it from the configuration, If you, for example, get a configuration file from a customer and you don't have access to the firewall, uh, then this could be a way to extract the X path or the XML path. But if you have access to the firewall, there is a much easier way. Just like when we went to the GUI and we did /debug, we will now do /API. And this is an amazing tool that Palo Alto has on the box itself as well to get information regarding to the API. As we mentioned in our first video, Palo Alto has two APIs: the XML API, which is the oldest one, the more mature one, and then you have the new REST API that uses JSON. So this one XML and this one JSON. And as I mentioned before, we convert everything to JSON. So in the future, it will be very easier for you as well to work with this one because you will understand JSON and how to work with it. But for now, we're using XML API. This is the one that we want to use. And let's try to get some specific information. Let's say I want to get the policies. How would I go forward in getting these policies? So in the beginning, most probably you will just look around and try to look at where it is and so on. But let's say I want to get the policies, the security policies. I want to print out the security policies. That looks like something interesting. So how do I do that? First of all, you have configuration commands and you have operational commands. And if you remember in the CLI, we mentioned something regarding to this operations part, right? Here. And in the debug as well, you saw something related to that. So this is also the same. Uh, we have operational commands, we have configuration commands. Let's try configuration commands. Okay. And where do I find my policies? Let's look at it from a firewall perspective. If we look at the firewall backup, how would you find the exact location of the firewall policies? So normally it would be under devices, right? And then under entry, which is localhost, which is the local firewall. And then let's see, you have VSys because our policies is under VSys. And then rule base, security. And as I click on these tags, you see that it's kind of building my path on the top, right? So security, and then you have rules, and then it seems that rule one, okay, looks fine. So it seems that it's under config, uh, configuration commands. Then we have devices here, entry, localhost, which is our entry localhost, which is our firewall itself. Then we have VSys. Then we have the entry again, which is the VSys one. Okay. Then we have rule base going down, rule base. Then we have security. Of course, if you want to get the NAT rules, you will not click security to NAT, PBF, QoS, whatever, but then click security. And then we can click what? Rules. Okay, very interesting. Now we see all the rules that I have in my firewall. If I go here, I have a couple of rules. My firewall is very slow. So rule 1, 2, 13, 14, 15, 21. And we have the same here. So this would be an interesting way to get all security policies. But it seems I can still click through on the policy. Let's click on a policy. Okay, now we get the exact parts of the policy. So the action, the application use, the description, the destination. So let's try to click through again. Okay, now allow, deny, and so on. So you can see that you can keep clicking through. Let's go back because we said we wanted the security policies, which is here. So now we have multiple things. First of all, look at this. We have a nice XML API URL that we could use in our API call. But let's see, I want to know if it really works, and I want to know if it gets me the information that I need, and I want to understand how I can get the information that I want to extract from it and how to parse it. How could I quickly make a call to get this information? Well, this is my XML API URL that we will use in the script, but this is the X path, and you have a button below that that says submit. So if I click submit, what it will do, it will, from the firewall itself, just do an API call with it has like it will use like a temporary key, if you want to call it like that, but it will make a real API call and get me the results. So now I can look at this and say, okay, I get the rules. All of my rules are here. This is what I want. Then per rule, it has all information. Okay, this looks like the call that I want to make, and and this is the information that I want. So I could just go back here and say, okay, perfect. Now let's print this out, or let's use this URL to get it in the script. Now let's add it here. Let's add it as a comment. So we have two parts, right? We have first the action. It goes up to the part of here. Sorry, the action is type. In this case, it's config. I think you can sense a pattern here, but let's take this part. Then we have the API key, right? So we had up to and action get type config, because before it was type what was it again? Op, the operational. So now we will have the type config. Let's call it URL again. Op operational. Now it will config, because again, remember, operations, configuration mode, and so on. Try to match these two things together. So we have this guy, and because we call it action, maybe we can add this part, so that the X path or the path will be all the way from here. And now remember when I said in the beginning, it really depends on how you will split up these URLs, and we could maybe change it in the later stage. This is the reason why, because not everything will be exactly the same. So now we have, this is the action, API type config action get. Okay. Again, we will get later to understand why this suddenly changed, but I just wanted to mention it so that you're very well aware of that these things can change. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I told you that it will change, but we started the way we started. So, and this is and XPath. So this is the API path. So now, of course, this will not work anymore. But as I mentioned before, result and response will always be there. So let's keep result and response as is. Let's run the API call again, and let's see if it will work. Look at that. Look at that. We just got all of our rules. Okay. And everything is here. So as you can see, especially for a beginner, this is an amazing way to create API calls. So if you just go to /API, you get all of this information. I can type /API will give you all of this information, and you could easily go through how do I generate logs, traffic logs, whatever you want to do. Look at how easy it is to create these let's say API requests based on that. You can go to operational just to show you this. You see, now suddenly we're at type equals op and CMD, the same as before. But when we go to configuration, it suddenly changed to API config as the type, action get, and then XPath instead of CMD. So we will get into more details about this later. For now, know that you could use these tools to generate your API calls. So I mean, only with this video, you unlocked a huge amount of potential to make API calls. So what I would say is, with this information, go out and make API calls, do get information, whatever. For example, now I will not go into details on how to print out, let's say, um, rule one. You should know this. Um, I won't give you this information anymore. You know how this works. If not, return back to the previous video. Little by little, we will build up on our knowledge, and I will not repeat the same thing multiple times. Just that either you know it and you will continue, or it's not really there yet. So we'll go back to the previous video and learn how you can exactly extract the fields that you want to use. And of course, you can let me do one last thing. We won't say that I didn't help. You go to the JSON, you paste it here, and now of course I won't go any further on how you can extract these rules. Um, so you could make any API call now, either through the API documentation, which is amazing. This is especially the one I recommend for beginners. Just go to your firewall /API, and you have a lot of documentation on the box. No need for internet. Even if you are a customer who doesn't have internet, just here. This is enough. Um, don't you find what you need? We go to the /debug for things that we do in the GUI, or debug CLI on in the CLI. And I think with that, you unlocked a huge amount of potential for all your API calls. For now, we will just keep it for that. And next video, we will add a new thing, let's say a new function in Python, or a new approach to how we can um, create things better and without adding repetitive tasks. And yeah, I think the next video will be very interesting, especially to see how you could unlock the potential of scripting and automation. Because until now, we just did API calls. It's great, we can get this information, but at the same time, someone will tell you like, why do I have to do this? I could just go to the GUI, uh, very easy. I could click here and then export to CSV, and I have the same without too much of a hassle. First of all, you're a negative person. I'm joking. No, I understand, but we have to start somewhere. And I think in the next video, you will see, or you will start to see the potential of automation and how it can really help.